I'll be talking about memory allocator security. So my name is Yves Yunan, and I'm a researcher at the Distrinet research group at the Catholic University of Leuven. I'm also a member of the No Login Security Research Group. So I'll start off by giving an introduction, then I'll talk about which attacks I will be describing. I'll describe these attacks in general terms, then I'll apply them to different memory allocators. I'll describe our own version of a more safer allocator, other safer allocators, and I'll also tell you why ours is better than theirs. And finally, I'll present our conclusion. So many allocators ignore security because they were designed to be fast and limit waste. So while these are noble goals, today security has become so important that we should also implement security in the memory allocator. Because they ignore security, they can often be be abused to perform code injection attacks. And we want to show that more security is possible at a relatively low cost. I'll be describing 3 attacks on memory allocators. Well, actually 2 attacks, and one is a specialized version of the first attack. So first, heap-based buffer overflows. So the heap is memory that is dynamically allocated at runtime, and overflows can also occur in this memory, of course. But since no return address is available, attackers must overwrite something else to be able to exploit it. An attacker could overwrite a data pointer or a function pointer which is stored in the heap, but these are not always available, so a more reliable technique is to overwrite the memory management information which is stored together with a chunk which is allocated on the heap. An off by 1 and off by a few bytes is a special case of buffer overflow. For these overflows, limited space is needed. Usually these are only exploitable on little endian machines, at least off by 1s are, because the least significant bit is stored before the most significant bit on those architectures. And off by a few bytes don't occur that often, but they demonstrate low space attacks. Dangling pointer references are pointers to memory that is no longer allocated. Dereferencing such memory is not checked in C, so generally this would lead to a crash, but when used together with the memory allocator, they could turn into a code injection attack when memory is deallocated twice, for example, because you could overwrite the memory management information. Okay, let's apply these attacks to several memory allocators. So I'll start by describing Doug-Lies memory allocator. On this, Linux uses a memory allocator which is based on this allocator, so they've improved it slightly for better performance for threading, but the main information is about the same. So in this allocator, every allocation is represented by a chunk, and the memory management information for a particular chunk is stored together with a chunk. When a chunk is freed, it's stored in a doubly linked list of free chunks, and an invariant of this allocator is that 2 bordering free chunks are always coalesced into a larger chunk. We'll base our description here on dlmalloc 2.7.2, and attacks on Doug-Lies memory allocator were first described by a Solar Designer in an exploit. So this is what a chunk looks like in this allocator, an allocated chunk. So chunk 1 contains the size of the physically previous chunk, the size of its followed by the size of its own chunk, and then it has space for the user data, so the user can write into this space. A free chunk looks like this. So again, the size of the physically previous followed by the size of its own chunk. However, the user data has been overwritten with a forward pointer which points to next free chunk, and a backward pointer which points to a previous free chunk. So in this case, chunk 4 is the first free chunk 2 is the second free chunk, and chunk 3 is the last free chunk. When such a chunk is removed from the doubly linked list of free chunks, the following code is executed. So first we get the forward of the current chunk, which we are unlinking, the back of the current chunk, and then we use the forwards backward. We set the forwards backward pointers to the back pointer and the backwards forward pointer to the forward pointer. This results in the chunk being removed from the list. However, if an overflow occurs in this memory, the attacker will be able to overwrite everything in chunk 2 if the overflow is in chunk 1. So in this case, the attacker has injected his code into chunk 1, and he modifies the forward pointer and makes it point to the return address. This can be used to overwrite arbitrary memory locations, as all the examples I will give, but we'll always use the return address as a location to overwrite. And then he makes the backward pointer point to his injected code. So now when the chunk is unlinked, the return address will be dereferenced, and the value of the backward pointer will be placed in over the return address. As a result, when the function returns, the attacker's code will be executed. I've left out some specific details, which I've described in a paper which is linked to this talk. So this is just a general idea, but I've simplified it a bit, so that you can follow the talk. So an off by one in the malloc is also possible. So chunks are always multiple of 8 bytes. So and as a result, the last 3 bits of the size field of the chunk are unused, and those are then used for information about the specific chunk. So in the malloc, it's used for 2 specific flags to mark if the chunk is mapped or not, and if the previous chunk is in use or not. To be able to do an off by one on the malloc, the 2 chunks must be right next to each other, so they must not be padded up to a multiple of 8 bytes. When this occurs, the previous size field of the next chunk will be used for data as well. This is to save some from some bytes by using it for data. So when an off by one occurs, as a result, we can overflow the size of chunk 2. We can overflow the least significant byte of the size of chunk 2, and we can set the prev in use bit to 0. Since the previous size field is used for data, we can just put in a smaller size for the previous size field, and when chunk 1 is later unlinked via chunk 2, because for coalescing, for example, it'll use this, it'll point into the smaller chunk, so the smaller size. So if we store a fake chunk in this space, which has a forward pointer, which again points to the return address, and a backward pointer, which points to the injected code, the unlink again will overwrite the return address with a pointer to the injected code. And the code will be executed when the function returns. Double free can occur in DL malloc and is exploitable. So in this case, chunk 1 is a free chunk of a larger size, and chunk 2 and 3 are the same size, and they're stored in a doubly linked list. When a chunk is freed, it's placed in the beginning of the list of free chunks of the same size. So if chunk 2 would be freed twice, it would be placed in the list again, and because due to the way it's placed into the list, it'll actually point to itself. However, when the chunk is reused, so for example, if we request a chunk of the same size, we'll get the first chunk in the list of free chunks. Chunk 2 will be returned, but it won't be unlinked because the forward pointer's backward pointer points to the chunk itself, and so on. So chunk 2 will still be in the list, but the attacker will now be able to write in this area. So since the attacker can now modify the forward and backward pointer, he can again make it point to the return address and his injected code. And when chunk 2 is now unlinked again, since it's still in the list, it can get unlinked again, the return address will be overwritten again. So our conclusion for this allocator is that it's vulnerable to heap overflows, off-by-ones, and double frees. Version 2.8 contains some mitigation techniques for these attacks, but we'll describe those in our related work section. CSRI and QuickFit are allocators which are very closely related to the malloc. So I won't go into too much detail, but I'll just give a quick overview of these allocators. So they both have the same representation when a chunk is in use. So at the top of the chunk is the size is stored, and at the bottom of a chunk, we also have the size of the chunk. The least significant bit of the size is used to denote if the current chunk is in use or not. In CSRI, when a chunk is freed, it looks like this. So it still contains the size of its chunks in the same positions. The use bit is set to 0, of course. And the previous and next pointers are stored at the end of the chunk. The old user data is overwritten with the hex value 125, so that the program would more likely crash if data is read from this location. QuickFit looks very much like dlmalloc, so we won't talk about exploiting QuickFit. So it uses the same forward and previous pointer stored right after the chunk size. An overflow in CSRI looks like this. So chunk 1 is again a chunk which is allocated and which will be overflowed, and chunk 2 is a free chunk which is stored in a list of free chunks. So when we overflow chunk 2, we can again make the previous pointer, in this case then, point to the return address, and the next pointer point to the injected code, and again when unlinking occurs, the code will be executed. So this is pretty similar to dlmalloc. A double free is not possible in this case because the in-use bit is checked before a freeing operation occurs. And off by 1 and off by 5 is not possible because the size of the chunk at the beginning is compared to the size of the chunk at the end. So if we'd modify this, it would result in an error, and the code would not be executed. PHK-malloc is the allocator used in FreeBSD. However, it's used in other BSDs as well by now. And it's the only allocator that we've looked at that takes advantage of the virtual memory system. It tries to minimize the pages that are used by the allocator. So it makes sure that objects that are smaller or equal to page size do not span multiple pages. To do all this, it has two layers on which it operates, the page layer and the chunk layer. Attacks for this allocator were first described by BBP. So the page layer manages allocation and freeing of pages. Information about the page, which is allocated to the heap, is stored in a page directory. This page directory contains, and the first elements in the page directory contain pointers to linked list of page information, which is for each possible size of chunks. So the size of chunks is pretty limited in this allocator, as I'll describe later. And for a particular size, there's a list of the chunk information. There's a list of the pages which contain chunks of that size. And other elements in the page directory contain information about a particular page. So malloc not mine is a page which is not allocated by PHK. Malloc free is a page that's free. And malloc first and follow are used for multi-page objects. So the first page for the multi-page object will be first, and the following pages will be marked as malloc follow. So this is an example of what it could look like. So the heap, in this case, contains two free pages, a large multi-page chunk,